There is no such thing as intellectual content in social media. Of course, setting aside lectures or math tutorials. And yet, classrooms are not the main part of the learning process. Most of it is developed through reading and writing. What do I mean by intellectual? I'm referring to an attitude of approaching things, normally problems of knowledge of some matter, through reason. And by intellectual content, I'm referring to one that spreads knowledge and understanding. It is important to note that there are a lot of fun facts and attempts at fostering curiosity and, in the best cases, critical thinking, but they do not fit into the definition of intellectual content. Why? Why do I say that there is no such thing as intellectual content in social media? That is because intellectuality requires not just knowing some facts, but also knowing the reasons why those facts are true. For that, a conceptual background is necessary, and because of its complexity, it doesn't fit well into the video format. It would be like if a movie that tells a story that spans over 3 months lasts all 3 months showing all the boring events that do not contribute to telling an engaging story. And it is not just that it doesn't fit into the format, which is in itself a nearly insurmountable barrier, but also that conceptual background is full of details that are essential to go from faith in the sources to true knowledge. And those details are complex and boring, not a good bet for positioning content in the platforms consumed by the brain rot generation. Everything you find on the internet that is labeled as intellectual content is actually pseudo-intellectual, because it pretends to inform about certain complex topics in philosophy and science, but in some cases is created by lay people on the topics they are talking about. Another problem is that to make philosophy and science something engaging and entertaining to reach the masses and result in a profitable product as a social media content or even a book, it has to be oversimplified, and in that process all the rigor is lost. Intellectuality is not just about learning some cool data or interesting facts, blindly believing based on the trust of the sources. A lot of people consider appearing in a book as a sufficient credential for the information's reliability. Intellectuality requires answering a question beginning from the very ground, following the path to the answer, all the way down from the evident, apparent but deceptive simple answer to the formulation of a theory intended to explain something. As I said, that path requires a conceptual background that, in the more developed sciences, given that they tend to be formalized, deals with symbolic logic and mathematics, not just complex words and an argumentative and imaginative reasoning. True understanding lies in the study of the logical and mathematical development of the question. Without that, if you are only repeating what you hear or what you read without questioning why it is true beyond the reliability of the sources, you are a pseudo-intellectual, more of the rhetoric or persuasive current. It's similar to the old division between philosophers and sophists. If you inform yourself about scientific matters through popular science books, you are not grasping even the 2% of the content of the real ideas. You are not even grasping the real problem that those ideas are intended to solve. But there is a light, a tiny space in social media for actual intellectual content, and that is one intended to spread curiosity, because that curiosity leads to searching rigor, and in that rigor is a truly intellectual attitude. But be careful, here I'm referring to content that leaves you not with a simple answer for a complex issue, but with a complex question related to a simple one, pointing at its importance and making that question a passionate matter, and the search of its answer a passionate and relevant endeavor. All of this came to my mind from listening to Joe Rogan's podcast, where he talks as though he understands biology and many other topics that he clearly doesn't. And he talks about those topics with huge confidence based on his blind trust in what he reads, and because of that, he believes himself to be sufficiently informed. However, my final point is that even if an expert launches a YouTube channel to disseminate science, the format itself is not sufficient for delving deeply into any complex topic. I believe that it could be due to the overstimulation and the attention span that the video format is optimized for. If long format podcasts succeed, it's because they are entertaining and easy to follow. This idea requires a deeper study from a cognitive science perspective, but I believe that the video format simply doesn't allow the same complexity of thought that symbols allow. It could be due to the rhythm of consumption and the time of reflection that is required for assimilating new complex information. The place for intellectuality is in academia, in a library or a laboratory, where the investigations are developed. Do not pretend to educate yourself through a podcast or a video. You may find in it some intriguing questions or ideas. But to achieve understanding, you are going to have to go beyond that. You have to go to the very root of that thing you call knowledge. And I tell you, every time you are going to require logic and mathematics. I insist, knowledge is not just complex words and persuasive arguments. That is rhetoric and literature. The true way to be profound, clear, and deep is through mathematics. Don't listen to those pseudo-intellectuals who pretend to educate you by explaining things in an oversimplified way. You may advance further in knowledge by asking questions about anything that catches your attention and seeking the most well-founded answer rather than by watching videos labeled as intellectual. I want to add an unrelated idea that was mentioned on Joe Rogan's podcast that inspired the former reflection.
If you could go back 200 years ago, you would be the wizard of the future. You know,
how many years? 200.
What you have in your head. I mean, with you, what you've accumulated. If you could go back in time with a fucking iPad and your Vsauce videos on YouTube, my God, you would be a king.
Maybe, but could I convince people? Just knowing something about the moon doesn't mean that they're going to believe me. And that's one of the things people don't think about when they imagine being the king if they could travel back in time, is that, sure, you could explain to people that where you're from, everyone has a cell phone, but could you invent one for them? No. Could you put a satellite up into orbit? No, but you could explain that in the future people will put things into orbit. But would you know more about how to get something into orbit than just some rando guy from the year 1200?
I certainly wouldn't, but some people would.
Yeah.
You probably would know. Well, you would certainly know more than I would, but you would know way more than they would. They would have to listen to you. If you had an iPad, they'd fucking for sure.
I don't know how helpful I'd be. I wouldn't know what kind of propellants to use. I would just be like, we need something strong enough to escape Earth's gravity. And they'd be like, well, okay. But what is that? And I'm like, well, I don't exactly know. I know that the space shuttle had liquid fuel in its tank, and it had solid fuel in its solid rocket boosters, the SRBs. And they'll be like, okay, but what is the fuel made of? I'm like, I don't know. Where do we get the fuel? I don't know.
Well, you would kind of have an understanding of explosions and propellants and things that are flammable.
Right. But does that mean that I could build a rocket? Could I explain to a culture how to make one? Well,
that's one of the cool things about human beings is that we work on each other's work.
Totally.
And without, like, Obama came under a lot of criticism for this whole, you didn't build it thing. Like, if you built a small business, you didn't build that infrastructure. You didn't build those. But that is kind of, it was. I don't think he was eloquently put, and it left open a lot of room for counter. Mm-hmm. But the reality of it is, every single thing that any human being has invented only took place because someone invented the ability to communicate, someone invented education, someone invented a society that's civil enough that you could think and pontificate on these things and not have to worry about the barbarians coming over the hills with fucking spears. Like, all of this only takes place because the only reason why you can build a rocket is because someone built alloys, because someone figured out propellants, because someone figured out contained explosion, because someone figured out velocity and speed and how much energy you actually have to escape the energy of gravity pulling you down, and all those the pull of the earth, and then the resistance of air, and all these different variables. There had to be untold number of people that had figured these things out before you came along with your next step.
Right. So how valuable would I be to people in the past? I feel like I'd be most valuable when it came to just like all the jokes that I know.
Putting aside that today's technology is not built by one person, but is a collective enterprise made possible by the cooperation of different experts specialized in very specific areas. The advancement of human knowledge comes every time from a philosophical revolution, specifically from a metaphysical shift. This implies a transformation of the way of understanding reality in its most general aspects. So, even if you don't know how to build a rocket or how to grow more food, with your modern worldview, with a scientific worldview alone, you would be able to secularize the people of the past. Of course, this supposes that you can formulate in a precise way the metaphysical assumptions of the scientific worldview, which are realism and materialism. This sounds complex, but it is merely to explain that there is a reality independent of the observer and that the universe is construed in its most fundamental elements by particles of matter that interact through causal relations instead of spiritual or miraculous ones. By understanding, or more accurately, by supposing with strong reasons, these principles, people of the past would be able to go really quickly from their primitive beliefs and understanding of nature to the development of something close to modern science. That was the case of humanity during the Dark Ages. It was stagnant for hundreds of years because of the religious mental frame, until a philosophical and scientific revolution came up against the dogmas and even the censorship of the time, posing the possibility of explaining and understanding the nature, therefore stripping it from its veil of divine mystery. That is the power of philosophy. It provides a deep insight and understanding of the general work of the world. In conclusion, the most valuable thing the modern human has regarding modern knowledge is the metaphysical assumptions that make the development of science possible, that is, a scientific worldview. The ethical question about whether the development of technology is truly progress is for another occasion. But for now, I can state that the knowledge that makes modern technology possible has yielded a profound advancement in self-discovery and self-knowledge, in understanding what we humans are and what our place in the universe is. And if technology has been misused, it is because of the lack of a deeper understanding of ourselves. The solution is not to go back to primitive times where we adore the sun and believe in mystical forces, but to go further from where we are, trying to unravel the mystery that surrounds us.